Right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a very interesting presentation that we shall shortly be hearing as part of the Centre for the Study of Global Human Movements research seminar series. I'm Caroline Lansky. I'm a lecturer here at the Institute, and I'm also a member of the Centre, and have a personal interest in music, although not this field, so I'm particularly interested to hear a bit more about this. So I'm just going to very briefly give you some information about a couple of another talk that is happening as part of the centre before we get going. So we have a research seminar series, and I just wanted to let you all know, as I know some of you might be having to leave before the end of today, that our next talk will be by Catherine Barnard on EU migrant worker, an EU migrant worker project. Migrants and their access to tribunals. So if this is of interest to you, this is on the 15th of May, and more details are on our website. So after that little plug, I just would now like to turn our attention to tonight's presentation. So we are incredibly honoured to have what I think is probably the first presentation on this exciting research project funded by the ERC, which is probably particularly valuable given all the sort of shifts that are happening within this country at the moment. This project is past and present musical encounters across the Strait of Gibraltar, and it's a 5-year project. The PI is Matthew here, and co-researchers are Stephen and Vanessa. And each of them are going to, Vanessa, sorry, and each is going to talk about the project, and they've got a very clear structure ahead, so I'm not going to do any more than just to say we are extremely pleased to have you with us, and we are very excited to hear about the project. And I understand there will be some presentations and then an opportunity for us all to ask questions a little bit more about it. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to you. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks ever so much. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks ever so much for coming, particularly for those who have to run off to bigger and better talks at 5 o'clock. We have Susan Kuzik presenting. So thank you for coming. It's great to have such a diverse audience as well, those from a musical and non-musical background. So I would like to thank the Centre in general for organising this talk, and also to Di and to Tuba and to Caroline for the kind introduction and for organising this session today. So my name is Matthew Machin-Autenrieth. I'm the PI for, as Caroline was laying out there, an ERC starting grant project called Past and Present Musical Encounters Across the Strait of Gibraltar. And today myself, Steve Wilford, and Vanessa Paloma Elbáz will be presenting case studies from our research around this theme of music movements and migration. Now, in the ERC project as a whole, we explore the musical encounters that exist between North Africa and Europe. An encounter here might refer to musical fusion projects, for example, that mix various genres for the Mediterranean region, and that are often based on the idea of some sort of shared cultural heritage between North Africa and Southern Europe in particular. Encounter can also refer to the exchange of musical knowledge through scholarship, through educational settings, through cultural organisations. An encounter might also refer to the sorts of intercultural social interactions that take place through music, whether that be between Jews and Muslims, or whether that be between North African communities and host societies in the diaspora. In the project then, what we are trying to do is explore how these musical encounters have been influenced by, and in turn themselves impact on, wider social and political factors, with a particular focus on European colonialism in North Africa and the present-day realities of migration into Europe. Now, this region is characterised by high levels of movement of numerous ethnic and religious communities between and beyond national boundaries. And as these communities move, they bring their music with them, maintaining cultural connections with their homelands and forging new musical and cultural relations in the diaspora. Now, today we're going to draw on case studies from our individual research projects to look at this complex relationship between music and migration. Steve will be looking at the role of the internet, and in particular social media, in the musical connections that are formed between Algeria and Algerian communities, mostly in the UK and France. I will be looking at Spanish-Moroccan intercultural musical exchanges in the city of Granada through the prism of one particular individual. And then Vanessa will be looking and examining the historical and contemporary movement of Jewish repertoires in and out of Morocco and the sort of multiplicity of these repertoires as they come into contact with various communities and geographies. Now, at a time of rising nationalism and anti-immigration rhetoric, it has fallen upon researchers from a range of academic disciplines to try to understand the social, cultural and political realities of migration. As debates rage about immigration and social integration, there's a necessity to understand the ways in which migrants from varying cultural backgrounds integrate into host societies, issues around community cohesion, and the identity politics that underpin cultural encounters in the diaspora. Now, this centre is testimony to the important work that is going on in this area across a range of academic disciplines. You might then be wondering, particularly those from a non-musical background, where does music fit in to these wider social issues? Now, as ethnomusicologists, we focus on the study of all forms of human music making from an anthropological perspective. That is, we're not interested in music simply as some sort of aesthetic object or form of entertainment. Rather, we argue that music is deeply interwoven with social, cultural and political realities, and the movement of people and their musics has become a central point of focus in ethnomusicological research. As people and communities migrate, a number of questions arise. What musics do they take with them? How does music function as a symbol of cultural identity for dispersed groups? How do people interact with the musical worlds they encounter as they migrate to new places of belonging? And what do communities change, adapt, or forget in the process of migration? It is these questions that guide our discussions today. Music functions as what the ethnomusicologist Thomas Solomon calls a social glue, a cultural phenomenon that can connect diasporic communities across the globe. It can function as a form of nostalgia for the homeland, a way of building cultural bonds across diasporic contexts, reinforcing ties between communities that may feel connected by culture, ethnicity, or religion, but that are disconnected by geography. But music can also operate as a mode of social integration and encounter, where musicians from different cultural backgrounds come into contact, forging new cultural forms and affiliations. And today we're going to explore these issues, drawing on ethnographic and historical work on the movement of communities and their musics, both within North Africa and into Europe. Now, just to give a brief sort of overview of the format today, I'm going to hand over to Steve in a second, who will give the first presentation, and then I will follow, and then Vanessa. Now, after each presentation, we're going to have just a few moments for questions, one or two questions. At the end, we'll have a short summary, and we'll open up the floor to general discussions related to all the papers and the panel as a whole. So I very much hope you enjoy, and I'm going to pass over to Steve now for the first paper.
Okay, so I'd like to start by playing you a bit of music. And for those of you who are not familiar with the music system as part of the world, you might have an idea of the sort of sounds, the sort of music, the sort of instruments that are used in sort of traditional North African music making. And the musicians that I work with in the UK and in France certainly engage with those sorts of instruments and those sorts of repertoires, but they also perform a much kind of broader range of music. So I want to play you something, one of the bands that I've worked with in London who perhaps not really expect when we talk about North African music. Okay, so it's a cold but sunny day in October 2013, and I'm sitting in a London cafe with Yazid, a singer and rapper who was born in Kabylie, a large Amazigh-dominated coastal region of northern Algeria. As a child, he moved to the UK with his parents and brother Masil, settling in Reading. Yazid and Masil shared passions of football and music, and having befriended a number of musicians at school and university, they formed the Papers, a rock and hip-hop influenced four-piece who have played extensively in venues throughout London and the southeast of England. On the surface, their music is not discernibly Algerian. Despite attending classes and workshops with Algerian Andalusian and rhyme musicians in their youth, they do not incorporate North African instrumentation or any musical ideas drawn from Algerian traditions into their sound, and Yazid sings and raps entirely in English. The only explicit marker of their Algerian identity is the vintage football shirt which you've just seen in this video, which Masil wears on stage in the band's videos. Yet despite Yazid living in Reading and Masil working in Paris during the week, the brothers are able to participate in the network of Algerian musicians and audiences active in contemporary London, positioning their group as part of the city's Algerian music scene. While they may not fit the model of the traditional Algerian musical ensemble, it would prove almost impossible to identify a musician or a group that typified Algerian music making in the city. Despite a relatively small Algerian population of perhaps 30 to 40,000 people, London's Algerian scene is vibrant and diverse, incorporating rappers and rye singers, cafes where shabi is performed, and a church hall that hosts weekly rehearsals by an Andalusi ensemble. While these musics are often performed in different contexts to different audiences, there is a greater degree of convergence between popular, art and folk musics and typically occurs in Algerian or French cities. In other words, it is a heterogeneous network of musicians and audiences, but one whose members share a cultural identity and a desire to construct a musical community that connects people both within the city and forms relationships with France and North Africa. A large proportion of the UK's Algerian population arrived in the late 1990s and early 2000s, often as a result of the decade-long violent civil conflict that engulfed their country. Most members of the community were born in North Africa, and it's only very recently the second generation has begun to emerge. Many of these people moved to study or work in Britain, and London's Algerian community has a significant component drawn from the educated middle classes. The UK is often seen as an alternative to France. There's a perception that discrimination against Algerians is significantly lower than in France, but with that comes a sense of cultural anonymity within the public sphere, and complaints about the supposed privileging of Moroccans and Moroccan culture in the UK are commonplace. While such competitive tensions are not uncommon in Moroccan-Algerian relations at governmental level and in people's everyday lives, there's a sense among the local community that Moroccan culture garners an unfair level of interest in Britain, shaped by everything from posters advertising holidays to the labelling of hummus on supermarket shelves. I should say that there are other I'm not being sponsored by Waitrose here, there are other forms of hummus available. Movement and status play a pronounced role in the lives of many members of the community. Musicians in London often face significant logistical challenges, particularly the physical dispersal of Algerians across the city and the lack of dedicated cultural spaces or institutional support for the local community. While pockets of Algerian presence can be found in Finsbury Park, Hounslow and Shepherd's Bush, an Algerian community has never been able to establish itself within a particular area of London, and this has limited the success of cultural initiatives from within the community. This necessitates movement around the city and increases the importance of musical performance. Music making and listening, whether within public or private spaces, provides Algerians with a rare opportunity for artistic creativity, social engagement, and a sense of reconnection with both the shared cultural identity and their own experience of migration. However, there's a surprising lack of mobility beyond London and the UK. Travelling to Algeria remains quite difficult, and it's only in recent years that Air Algérie have started operating a single daily flight from Gatwick to Algiers. In comparison to France, where there are numerous flights and overnight ferries, it's quite difficult for Algerians in Britain to travel to North Africa. The Eurostar offers a means of visiting friends and family in France, but London's Algerian community remains relatively disconnected and isolated, at least in physical terms. And it's this sense of detachment and marginality in some ways that I suggest helps to explain the strong desire for community and the importance of the internet and musical practices of Algerians living in the UK. In recent years, the internet, particularly social media, have played a central role in the musical networks of local Algerian performers and listeners, not only within London but also transnationally, shaping their engagement with both North Africa and diaspora populations in France and Spain. The internet forms the focus of my paper today, and I will interrogate some of the ways in which it is entangled with movement and stasis, the past and the present, the personal and collective, and the virtual and physical. Allow me now to return to my coffee-fueled conversation with Yazid. The papers have a well-developed internet presence, combining their website and YouTube channel with social media platforms such as Facebook. This content is tightly managed and, as with many musicians, enables the group to articulate a clear ethos. This is nowhere more evident in the personal statement found on their website, which, given the focus on the human movement of this research centre, I feel merits quoting at some length. So they say, well, I'm not sure if you can read that, they say, when people talk about being on a paper chase, anyone who's spent time in immigration has to bust a smile. They say you need paper to make paper, so what's that sheet with the visa stamp worth? Growing up on the other side of Cemetery Junction in Reading was something like living in the Home Office. Bare heads from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, everyone at a different stage in the immigration process. For children of immigrants, first or second generations, life's like 1 foot in the UK, 1 foot back home, so where's our head at? A world without paper, passports or permanent stay. Not all money, but never without role models, inspiration. A world of shotters, PhDs working petrol stations, different cultures, same situation. No papers to fold, stack for tomorrow. No papers to show immigration if they come around your home. Plenty of papers to roll in the meantime, though, standard. As we unpack this statement, we can see that the group's sense of belonging is situated in multiple locations, so 1 foot in the UK, 1 foot back home. That they position themselves as products of multicultural Reading, formed through a specific set of circumstances and experiences. We might read this as a fusion of sounds and ideas that is almost inevitable within the contemporary British city, serving to reinforce a type of multicultural discourse around urban cosmopolitanism that Tina Ramnarin has called the musical melting pot. But as I dug deeper into my conversation with Yazid, I realised that this was an oversimplification and that being Algerian, whatever that might mean, remained extremely important to the band. Yazid explains that I wanted the Algerians to be proud of us. We're Zidane, if you know what I mean. Even if it's not necessarily your music, as long as you think it's good, it's cool and you like it, then you might see that we're Algerian. If I saw something and I was on the fence with it a bit, but then I saw that there was an Algerian flag, I'd feel like out of solidarity, I should like it. And he's referring to Zinedine Zidane, the famous French footballer there, who is kind of born in France to Algerian parents and kind of been adopted by the French community. I don't have time today to delve into the long and complex history of Algerian nationalism, but anyone familiar with the Maghreb will understand that the combination of the country's war of independence and civil conflict has produced a post-colonial state shaped by a government that openly propagates a form of Arabized monocultural nationalism. And this, I should add that many of those that I've worked with are critical of this political nationalism, and this applies in particular to Yazid, given his Amazigh roots. However, this culture of nationalistic pride alongside a desire for local community helps us to understand the group's foregrounding of their Algerianness. We may therefore expect the papers to work tirelessly to promote themselves within the local Algerian community. This is not necessarily the case. Yazid acknowledges their limited success in this regard and contrasts his group to other musicians, stating that their music is perhaps open to everyone except the Algerian community over here, because they would want an Algerian thing. It's like Sheb Nassim, even Yaz Fantazi. I guess they cater to all that. So he's referring to two much more kind of traditional Algerian musicians in that case. In other words, their music does not sound Algerian enough to cater to the taste of the local community. As another musician explained to me, the papers are, quote, their own kind because when you take their band, it's formed of British people born here and Algerians. That's the difference, it's totally British, their music. However, this perceived difference also proves beneficial to the group. Yazid explains that through the internet, they've been able to attract listeners in Algeria for whom their music is apparently familiar but intriguing. He notes that we actually try to push it more in Algeria back home, because we figure that they have their Algerian rap out there, Shabi or whatever, and ours is a bit of a different flip on things. It's European, it's Western music, but we're Algerian, there's Algerian in there. Such suggestions are not unique to Yazid and his group. A similar claim is made by Rashida, an Andalusi singer who is a particularly active member of the local community and head of Culturama, an independent, unfunded, grassroots-level cultural organisation that promotes Algerian events in London. As a member of the Al-Andalus caravan, an ensemble who perform the esteemed Andalusi musical traditions of central Algeria, she was approached for an interview by El Watan, one of Algeria's largest newspapers. The ensemble promote themselves as an association, a term which denotes a desire to teach and retain historically informed music practices. And while they're keen to attract non-Algerian audiences, they do not participate in any sort of fusion projects. Machin's interview appeared in print and online in 2013, drawing significant interest from readers in North Africa and Europe, which he believes came from a perceived sense of difference. Readers were accustomed to hearing about Andalusi roots in Algeria or France, but the caravan's presence in London was something unique, affording them a sense of cultural capital that might not be available to similar groups elsewhere. The circulation of such materials online can also bring with it certain pressures, particularly from friends and family members. Ashida is politically active and often outspoken, and she recalls her own awareness of the potential reception of the interview, noting that my article came out in the newspaper. I lived quite a lot in Algeria in various places, and I lived in conservative places where people are going to read the article. And I was thinking, what's my dad going to think? But I wasn't worried because it's Andalusi. You're sitting down wearing a kaftan, which is traditional, and holding an instrument. It's not right, very disreputable, popular form of music. You're not standing there with makeup and big nails and singing rye or variety. So because the music is classical, therefore it's prestigious, not everybody has access to it. My dad would never have been happy for me to go on stage if it wasn't Andalusi. If I said I wanted to sing rye, of course not, it's impossible. We weren't even allowed to listen to it at home. Other members of the caravan who you see here have articulated similar concerns relating to the perceived standard of their musicianship amongst Andalusi ensembles elsewhere. While they design musical exchanges with associations in Algeria or France, some fear that they will face exposure as relatively inexperienced amateurs. This is of less concern for newer members of the caravan, but for established musicians, the risk associated with recordings of their performances being shared are tangible. Tufik, the ensemble's director, for example, trained at a leading music conservatoire in Algiers and maintained strong links with musicians and instrument makers in North Africa. For him, there's an undoubted threat to his artistic reputation if the musical practices of his association are deemed substandard by listeners in France or Algeria, many of whom are experts in Andalusi repertoire and performance practice. Nevertheless, Tufik, who you see on the right here, has been keen for the caravan to adopt social media. Alongside the obvious logistical benefits of communicating with a physically dispersed group of musicians, technology supports his teaching practices and allows the association's members to familiarise themselves with repertoire and performance practice. He explains that it is possible, in fact, to use technology for what we do. So Facebook is a very important point of contact, to look at pictures and listen to records, spread messages, inform people of what's going on and what's happening. I think it's a good practice. At the end of the day, technology was intended to help people. It was meant to help people to do their things. Technology also allows the caravan to connect with similar Andalusi groups in Algeria and France, enabling them to interact with the transnational network of associations who perform, teach and appreciate Andalusi music. Singer and oud player Yasmin explains that there are a lot of videos on our Facebook page that are of associations in Algeria, which is good because it kind of creates a community across borders on one page. What's good about it is that with the people who are in the associations in Algeria or France, we can exchange ideas or videos of what we think is good, and we can go and talk about it. It's a good way of sharing information about that music on the net. Having spent a significant amount of time with the caravan, I began to understand that their use of the internet was shaping the musicians' lives in profound ways. I was frequently told of the emotional and psychological benefits that they felt from performing Andalusi, and it became apparent that by sharing recordings, the musicians were negotiating forms of personal and collective memory. This was evident when Tufik shared a video of popular singer Mariam Abeid performing on Algerian television in 1957, which Yasmin, who just returned from a trip to Algeria, responded to with the comment, I was listening to this with my mother recently. Let me just play a very short clip of this. So this is the recording that she was listening to. So when I discussed this interaction with her, she described how listening to the recording in London had made her reflect upon her family and childhood in Algeria, as well as her own experiences of migrating and settling in the UK. Caroline Landau discusses the ways in which the internet shapes collective and personal memories, describing this as, quote, accelerating and heightening the experience of this becoming of self. Music mediated through global digital technologies can locate the consumer in numerous times and places in rapid succession, often simultaneously. We might understand these videos and audio clips as what Pierre Nora terms lieux de mémoire, or sites of memory. Those objects which act as sites of cultural memory, as the sense of historical distance from them and our own understanding of the past increases. It is the role of music in these acts of personal and collective memory, in public and private contexts, that is central to my final example today. While many of the Caravan's online interactions are internal to the association, so kind of shared amongst the musicians within the group, Rihet Bladi, London's only Algerian radio station, uses the internet to reach a much wider listenership. Created in 2011 by Jamel, a restaurant owner based in Brixton, the station's weekly broadcasts are exclusively online and attract listeners around London as well as abroad. Jamal is extremely knowledgeable about Algerian music and keen to use the station to foster a sense of community for the city's diaspora. He explains that when he created the station, the main things were to concentrate on the Algerian community and to give them a sense of help. And if there's something that we need to talk about or we need to highlight something, like an event that's happening, we're there to broadcast it. His Sunday evening broadcasts often reach audiences in 35 countries with up to 1,000 listeners each week. Jamal refuses to discuss politics on the station and instead sees music as a way of bringing the community together. As with Yasmin's reaction to the Mehdi Mabed recording, Jamal believes that these shows facilitate processes of remembering for his listeners, enabling them to reconnect with memories of Algeria while escaping the challenges of daily life in London. He reflects that I needed to give him, so his Algerian listener, something to take his mind off everything and bring him back to memories of his family when he was little. We put on something that makes him go, oh, this song reminds me of that, this song reminds me of this. And the listener starts to go back. The radio becomes part of his childhood and his memories, and he will cherish it. So that's exactly my idea, to give them something to bring them back to where they used to be. Things that being here in London they forgot all about. At the same time, this is 20 or 30 years after, and they're still remembering themselves as kids. He plays a broad range of Algerian musical styles, but is careful to monitor and censor the musical content of broadcasts. Conscious of his audience, he notes that I have a lot of families listening to me on a Sunday. They have their dinner when the radio starts, they put it on in the background and listen. They're here in London, here in England, and they say to me that it's just a way reminds them of home, so it's a good thing. I'm just keeping it that when I don't want to destroy it. In his view, this provides a justification for regulating the musical content of shows, and he does not play anything from the popular Rai genre, which is perhaps the most sort of internationally well-known Algerian music. Jamal explains that if you go deep down into it, you understand that there's good Rai and bad Rai. Bad Rai is covered up with beautiful music, so sometimes you've forgotten about the lyrics and it makes you dance. But if you listen to the lyrics, it's horrible, disgusting. Although Jamal paints a portrait of families sharing a meal while listening to the shows, he's conscious of the challenges faced by certain members of the community, particularly young men without legal residency status here in the UK. Returning to a theme that I explored with the Aziz Band at the start of my paper, it's clear that for some of Rihet Bladi's listeners, the issue of paperwork is pressing. As Jamal states, I think you have to bear in mind that there are people who have no papers here, who are illegal here, and it's quite a high percentage. They can't go to Algeria and they feel disconnected. They can only know what is going on in Algeria from what their family tells them, or from what people who've been to Algeria and have come back. But to have a radio where it's based in London and they're talking directly with people in Algeria, and they listen to a radio presenter who's based in London who speaks Algerian Arabic, if I was a person who didn't have papers, I would feel more content. Through the broad range of experiences and opinions that I've discussed today, from radio station DJs, musicians in Andalusia associations and members of bands, it's clear that the internet plays a myriad of complex roles in the musical practices of Algerians in contemporary London. These processes are closely tied to the experiences of the local Algerian community who simultaneously face a sense of dispersal and disconnection across the city and find themselves positioned at the fringes of transnational Algerian networks. Locally, social media enables musicians and audiences to connect with one another, facilitating performances and listening opportunities that provide a rare platform for Algerian culture and community building within the city. At the same time, the internet provides the possibility to engage and interact with musicians and audiences elsewhere in ways that support music making and offer new opportunities for Algerian musicians in London. At the heart of these processes are a distinct sense of shared cultural identity, a form of Algerianness that explains the desire for a stronger local community and a greater engagement with global Algerian cultural networks. Music, whether produced locally or elsewhere, in contemporary or historical context, provides Algerians in London with a chance to experience and share their sense of cultural identity and to engage with individual and collective forms of memory. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Steve, for a wonderful presentation. So we have time for one or two questions before we move on to the next.
Yeah, thank you. It was really fascinating. And I wonder if I may take you to the question of linguistic politics. Mm-hmm. You left us with a quotation about listening to Algerian Arabic, but I was very struck that the papers seem to be singing very much in English.
Yeah.
There were a few French sort of interventions on one of the other websites, but the interview, the quotations are very English. And I just wondered where, it was interesting the comment you made about the disgusting lyrics if you understood them.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about how that diaspora connects through language in tandem with music, and how many of them sort of actually bypass the language to music. Is the radio show, if you like, hosted in English?
The radio show is in English, French and Darija, so Algerian Arabic. And Jamel kind of prides himself on his ability to switch between those three languages fairly quickly, so he'll translate things from one into the other fairly quickly for his audience. My sense from speaking to him, but also speaking to people who listen to the radio show, is that most of them are expecting to hear something in Arabic, and that's the language that they're communicating in mostly. The papers that I spoke about at the start, so Yazid doesn't speak Arabic, but he does speak Amazigh, which is quite unusual, particularly because so many people within the community are first-generation migrants who kind of moved over in the 90s and 2000s. So Arabic is still very present, I'd say probably more present than it would be in France, for example. So it's quite common for people to be speaking in three languages at any one time, which makes doing the interviews, as I discovered, quite difficult when people are switching kind of sentence by sentence between different languages. But the shared language, I would say, is mostly Arabic. But people expect to kind of switch between those fairly quickly. So in the case of Rai, for example, or kind of a lot of its Andalusi, well, Andalusi repertoire is slightly different because it's much more kind of historical, traditional Arabic. So it's, I guess, something akin to kind of Shakespearean English in some ways. But in terms of kind of rhyme music and the sort of Arabic that's spoken on the streets, most of his listeners would understand those words, I think.
Any other questions? Tati?
Can I ask you a question about notions of home? I think I was kind of struck that this word home kept coming up. And there was something about the positionality of all these people with different genders, ages, racialised, all this stuff going on. And I just wondered, in a way, how this home was managed to be, also with the nuance of the geography there, how it was somehow maintained, or if it wasn't. I don't know. There was something about that notion of home that I thought was quite interesting.
I think it's a very kind of idealised and kind of historicised in some ways idea of home. So I think there's a shared sense of home there, but I think it's people's kind of memories of what that home would have been in the 1980s in many of these cases. I think because the community is relatively new in London, there's still that strong sense and that kind of strong yearning for home, being North Africa, being Algeria. In the sense that people don't feel as though London is necessarily home, or the UK is necessarily home for them. I think part of that is because people moved, I guess, relatively recently, so you're not really, for the most part, dealing with a second generation. But you're also dealing with people who have kind of grown up with that heightened sense of kind of nationalistic pride and nationalistic identity throughout the 1990s. and before that as well. So I think it's kind of an idealised, I don't know if that answers your question, but kind of an idealised home that's based on people's personal memories and what they want Algeria to be, which is perhaps not necessarily what it is, but it's certainly a sense of home that's rooted in North Africa rather than the UK or London. Because there's a question that I ask quite often, kind of people's feelings of belonging or feelings of kind of their position within the UK. And it was partly the sense that they didn't feel a sense of belonging in the UK, but also this sense that nobody was interested in them. So the kind of the Moroccan thing that I was talking about at the start, which was not only do we don't feel as though we kind of belong here in some ways, but also nobody's really interested in our food or our music or our culture in any way, shape or form. And so I think that in some ways, whether that's real or imagined, serves to kind of distance that ability for people to feel a sense of home in the UK. I don't know if that helps at all.
Probably Theresa May putting things on the buses probably adds another
doesn't
layer in there too.
So one very quick question or comment.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question actually about the photograph of that Andalusian ensemble, because it was interesting to see how they positioned themselves in a very traditional Andalusian way, in a garden, which is also very traditional for an Andalusian, but with a brick wall and like something like, where was it taken, and how interesting that they would choose to recreate a kind of an Andalusian garden in London.
So that's actually the garden outside the church hall where they rehearsed in Pimlico. And so I think it might... I think it was coincidental that the garden was there, but I think their use of it was not coincidental, if that makes sense. So I think it was a happy coincidence in that sense. It's a real mixture of people. This is a photo from 2011, I think, so when the group had just sort of started and was a lot smaller than it is now. So Tufik Houston in the middle here is, as I said, kind of a conservatoire-trained Andalusi musician, very much part of those kind of Andalusi networks, very much about retaining the heritage and the tradition and all those sorts of tropes that you get with Andalusi. So I think it is staged in that way, and I think you're right, it kind of completely buys into the, sort of the imagery of what an Andalusi ensemble looks like. And I think partly that is, again, about that photo appearing on Facebook and being received by audiences in France or in Algeria, and kind of being a statement in some ways that you can take us seriously because we know what we're doing and we know how to present ourselves and we know how to play into that idea of what an Andalusi ensemble looks like and all those sorts of things. So, yeah. So
it's funny because it reminds me of there's a place that looks kind of like that in Tétouan, but obviously the architecture is totally different.
Yeah.
But you know, with the barrier up and the tree, the whole thing. So it's just like a superposition.
Thanks so much, Steve. So we're going to move the geographical focus a little bit down to the sun-drenched Andalusian region. So, in my recent research, I've been focusing on collaborations between Spanish and Moroccan musicians, above all in the city of Granada in southern Spain. Now, drawing on the idea of a shared cultural history between Spain and Morocco, these musicians have brought into dialogue two musical genres, namely flamenco and Arab Andalusian music, that are both believed to trace their roots to medieval Muslim Spain. And many musicians that I've worked with describe these fusion projects as a form of interculturalism, a way of crossing cultural boundaries and facilitating the integration of Moroccans in the city. However, such a rosy picture presents only half the story. In my research, I'm also interested in the power inequalities at play between Moroccan and Spanish musicians, and the ways in which Moroccans need to adapt their music making to fit into the broader social and cultural trends in Spanish society. So I want to explore the complex ways in which music can both emphasise Moroccan difference and also facilitate intercultural dialogue between different communities. And today I'm going to focus in on my research conducted with one particular musician, Suhail Sakhini, to analyse these dynamics of intercultural music making in the city. But first of all, a little bit of context. Now, this isn't a tourism advert, I promise you, but so Granada is famous for its architectural legacies, such as the Alhambra and the Elbáz. And Granada is most often associated with the cultural history of Al-Andalus, a term usually referring to the territory under Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula between 711 AD and 1492. Al-Andalus is frequently related to the notion of convivencia, the alleged harmonious coexistence of Christians, Jews and Muslims in medieval Spain. Amongst historians, debate rages about the realities of such a claim. Maria Rosa Menacal depicts Al-Andalus as an ornament of the world, and I quote, a model of tolerance and coexistence, some sort of glorious lost paradise of interfaith exchange that gave way to numerous cultural, philosophical and scientific innovations that in turn kick-started the Renaissance in Europe. Yet a number of historians, such as Ana Akasoy, Brian Catlos, Fernandez Morera, and many others, have sought to unveil the realities of what many people call the populist myth of convivencia, exploring the complex dynamics of socio-cultural exchange in medieval Spain. Rather than painting a sort of idyllic museum of peaceful coexistence, historians have instead illustrated the tensions that existed between tolerance and intolerance, cultural exchange and violence. Now, in this talk, I'm not interested in the validity of Al-Andalus or convivencia in the past, but rather its capacity to function as a metaphor for cultural and musical exchange in the present. As the anthropologist Jonathan Shannon notes, Al-Andalus is good to think, and convivencia is often, and I quote, invoked to promote pluralism, mutual understanding and tolerance in Europe. In Andalusia, the southernmost autonomous region of Spain, convivencia serves both as a model for contemporary intercultural relations and as a golden age in regional history. And in Granada, cultural organisations invest considerable resources in promoting the legacies of Al-Andalus and the city's former Muslim and Jewish populations as a source of local pride and ultimately money, especially through the tourism industry. But another group states a claim to Granada's multicultural heritage, the city's large and diverse Moroccan community. Granada has one of the largest concentrations of Moroccan expatriates in Andalusia, including a high number of students and those from middle-class backgrounds who have made the city their home. As the anthropologist Robin Finlay argues, many Moroccans claim, and I quote, a diasporic right to the city due to the legacies of Al-Andalus. Now here it's important to bear in mind that during the 800 years of Muslim presence in Spain, there were various return migrations of Muslims and Jews to North Africa, most notably following the Catholic reconquest of Granada in 1492, and later on Vanessa will touch on the Sephardi communities, the Jewish communities who continue on that legacy. Now some Moroccan Muslims claim genealogical links to the old families of Al-Andalus, to the extent that to be Andalusian in Morocco, that is, of Al-Andalus heritage, has become what Shannon calls a quasi-ethnicity. Therefore, Moroccans in Granada often experience a sense of attachment and belonging encoded in the history of the city. This connection between history and Moroccan immigration is also evidenced by the fact that parts of the Moroccan community in Granada are highly visible. This visibility is most notable in the historic centre, where many Moroccans have set up their own businesses, including tea shops, restaurants, craft shops and so on and so forth, in Oriental-themed streets, which are meant to hark back to the days of Al-Andalus, thus capitalising on the commercial potential of the city's Oriental past through the tourism industry. However, other more sinister forces are at play in the social relations between majority and minority communities. Like other countries in Europe, right-wing populism and anti-immigration rhetoric is on the rise in Spain, and the Moroccan community are often targeted. Graffiti in Granada, such as Moors Get Out, is an uncomfortable reminder of an underlying narrative in Spanish society in which Moroccan immigration is conflated with the Muslim invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, where Moroccan Muslims are conflated with the idea of the invading Moor. The Granadan delegation of the far-right party Vox, which recently won seats in the Andalusian parliament, and this is a major political earthquake in Spain, it's the first time in which a far-right party has gained some degree of representation since the Franco regime. This particular party recently tweeted an inflammatory message in support of the annual celebration of the Catholic reconquest of Granada, which ended Muslim rule. You can see this here, and I'll just translate. So on the 2nd of January 1492, the taking of Granada took place, in which the last Islamist stronghold was expelled from the peninsula. We should feel proud of our history and prevent the same invader from trying to dominate us again. In my research, I'm interested in how music making is involved in these debates regarding immigration and intercultural contact between Spaniards and Moroccans. In what ways might music facilitate integration and the overcoming of racism and Islamophobia? Or to what extent does music mark out Moroccan difference and actually obscure the negative realities of immigration? To try to answer these questions, I'm going to focus attention on a particular type of fusion referred to as flamenco andalusi. Here musicians combine flamenco, the most representative music and dance tradition of southern Spain, with Arab Andalusian music. This latter genre refers to a collection of styles that are believed to have originated in Al-Andalus that now exist in various forms across North Africa, and Steve touched upon Andalusi music in his paper. Now in Granada, Spanish and Moroccan musicians draw on a common, yet somewhat debatable, origin story which situates flamenco and Arab Andalusian music as cultural byproducts of Al-Andalus, as born of the same root. As such, many musicians regard the fusion of flamenco and Arab Andalusian music as natural. It's a product of history and the bringing together of two sister genres. What I'm interested in today is not so much what this fusion is or isn't, nor am I really interested in whether the idea of a shared musical genealogy is historically accurate. Rather, I'm interested in what this fusion does and what it means in the context of Spanish-Moroccan relations. And to do so, I'm going to focus on my research with Suhail Sahimi. So Suhail was born in Tétouan in northern Morocco, but moved to Granada in the 1980s when a number of Moroccans, the first sort of big wave of Moroccan migration into the country, to study translation at the city's university. He was one of many middle-class educated Moroccans at the time who migrated to Granada for study and or to seek better economic opportunities. He originally trained as a classical guitarist at the Conservatoire of Music in Tétouan, but also learned the oud and Arab Andalusian music from a young age. He's keen to point out, though, that his musical upbringing was much more diverse. He actively listens and performs a range of genres, including blues, jazz, rock, gnawa, rai, and flamenco. And it's this more cosmopolitan edge, we might say, that perhaps marks him out from some other prominent musicians in this relatively small fusion scene in Granada. Suhail began to fuse flamenco and elements of Arab Andalusian music in the 1990s through the formation of his own ensemble, which he continues to this day. I'm just going to give you a brief example here so you can hear the sort of thing that Suhail is involved in. Okay, so that gives you a brief sort of idea of the sort of things that Suhail is involved in. So alongside his work as a translator and coordinator for an intercultural project at the Public Library in Granada, Suhail's music making is central to how he views his relationship with Andalusian society. It's a vehicle through which he engages in what he calls interculturalism. Now, it's important to bear in mind that this is a political term, usually, but it's actually something that he actively uses. So this isn't me simply supplanting terminology on a musician, but actually using a term that he incorporates into his own musical practice. Indeed, his professional life as a translator transfers to how he views music as a mechanism for the translation of different cultural identities. Suhail is an interesting case when considering Moroccans in Granada overall. He is well integrated, has lived in Spain for over 30 years, and possesses dual citizenship. He identifies as Spanish Moroccan, yet he still feels that he is othered as a Moroccan, as a Muslim. He told me, when Spanish people hear my name, Suhail, or that I am a Muslim, they mark me out as an immigrant, as different, even though I speak Spanish better than they do. What I wish to focus on then is how Suhail uses music as a way to facilitate his integration and to overcome the perceived cultural distance between Moroccans and Spaniards by drawing on ideas of musical commonality. In particular, I want to ask, how does Suhail make his own cultural identity compatible, we might say, with the discourses in Andalusian public life? Now, that question has a number of answers, but today I want to focus on two particular aspects that seem to characterise Suhail's musical output. First, his relationship with Andalusian regionalism, and second, how his music channels this idea of interculturalism and what that might mean in his musical practice. Following the death of the dictator Francisco Franco in 1975, Spain began a long fought-for process of decentralisation and the eventual establishment of 17 autonomous communities, all with varying degrees of devolved powers. Andalusia, the southernmost autonomous region, has a long history of regional pride, and the political movement for autonomy stretches back to the 19th century. One of the central planks of so-called Andalusismo, or Andalusian regionalism, is the history of Al-Andalus and this idea of convivencia, the coexistence of different faiths. The alleged confluence of cultures in the region's past is said to form the basis for Andalusia's architectural legacies, food and customs. And this perceived golden age of Al-Andalus is promoted by various organisations in the region, such as Casa Árabe, Fundación Tres Culturas, the Foundation of Three Cultures, and Legado Andalusí, the Andalusian legacy. Suhail taps into Andalusian regionalism in various ways. At one level, he emphasises in his music the promotion of Andalusian regional history. For example, he makes frequent reference to key regional figures such as Blas Infante, the so-called father of Andalusian regionalism, thus aligning his musical output with a key symbolic figure in Andalusia's struggle for autonomy. It's important to bear in mind that Infante himself was highly invested in the relevance of flamenco for Andalusian identity and history, and drew close associations between flamenco and the region's multicultural and most notably Muslim past. Moreover, Suhail is actively involved in institutional projects that celebrate the regional history of Andalusia, such as through educational workshops, in which he uses music as a tool to teach young Andalusians about their own past. But the most notable way in which Suhail taps into Andalusian regionalism is through his engagement with flamenco. It's important to keep in mind that while flamenco at a global level may well be associated with Spain as a whole, within the country is most commonly associated with Andalusia, so much so that flamenco has become a politically sanctioned emblem of regional culture, we might say, and one that is heavily subsidised by the regional government. Flamenco forms an important part of everyday public life in Andalusia, as well as benefiting the region economically as one of its primary cultural exports and tourist attractions. Moreover, given its alleged links to Al-Andalus and similarities with Arab Andalusian music, flamenco is promoted by Andalusian institutions as a bridge between cultures. Since arriving in Spain, Suhail has become much more adept as a flamenco performer himself, both in guitar and singing, and he often incorporates Arab Andalusian muwashahat, or poetic forms that can be traced back to Al-Andalus, sung in Arabic in a flamenco style, thus melding together these two genres. He told me, I feel like a flamenco, and when I perform it, I feel it. You could say that I have an ear for flamenco and I have an ear for Arabic music. I'm divided in two. It's this notion of being divided in two that seems to characterise Souhail's own identity as a Spanish Moroccan in Granada. The very fact that he's knowledgeable in flamenco affords him a degree of cultural capital. That is, he's able to engage with Andalusians on their own musical terms. For a Moroccan to be proficient and emotionally engaged with such a strong symbol of regional culture indicates to the host society a wish to belong, a wish to integrate. Yet, it's important to stress a degree of power imbalance here. As Brian Carl has noted, Moroccan musicians need to adapt to the cultural monopoly of flamenco in order to get work. As one of his interviewees told him, Moroccans need flamenco, not the other way round. In other words, there is limited space or appetite in Andalusia for Moroccan musicians to showcase their own musical genres unless they are channeled through flamenco. As such, Souhail's ability to draw on such a potent symbol of Andalusian regional pride means he is able to make his difference safe, shall we say, and compatible with the host society, but one could argue that he loses something of himself in the process. However, I don't want this critique to give the sense that Souhail is simply pandering to local tastes with little control over his own musical identity. It's important to recognise that Souhail was exposed to flamenco from an early age, and he has always been deeply invested in the alleged links between flamenco and Moroccan Arab Andalusian music. As such, flamenco isn't simply an Andalusian product that Souhail has needed to conform to or bolted onto his practice. It is intrinsically part of his own musical identity. But the factor that really seems to be my second sort of main area here, the factor that really remains at the core of his practice is this idea of interculturalism, which he means, or he refers to as, an act of musical dialogue that binds together both difference and commonality. He told me, and I quote, that interculturalism is felt more in the dialogue between flamenco and Arab Andalusian music, due to their alleged shared historical roots. And overall, Souhail draws on the intercultural potential of these fusions to, and I quote, raise the Andalusian population's awareness, or sensibilidad in Spanish, which is just a great word, to raise the Andalusian population's awareness of Moroccan culture, while at the same time enabling dialogue to emerge between those from different cultural backgrounds. Souhail uses his music as a way of deconstructing the image of the Moroccan other by illustrating the commonalities that exist between Andalusians and Moroccans in musical terms. Now, as a result of his self-professed interest in interculturalism, Souhail has raised his profile amongst cultural institutions in Andalusia, so much so that he is frequently contracted as a musician, as a speaker, and as an educator for various so-called intercultural projects that draw on the narrative of interfaith dialogue and multicultural diversity in Al-Andalus to promote the integration of Moroccan communities in the present. A good example here is a project that was called Flamenco de Orilla a Orilla, so flamenco from shore to shore, which ran between 2012 and 14. And this project drew on the idea of a shared musical history between Morocco and Spain, both to promote flamenco's presence in Morocco and to facilitate the engagement of Moroccans in Andalusian cultural life. And this was through an array of workshops, lectures, concerts held in various locations, both in northern Morocco and in Andalusia itself. And I don't have time to go into the details of it, we can always sort of talk about that in question time. What's interesting here in the Andalusian context is that the Andalusian Department for Migratory Policies was involved here. And this particular organisation stated that Flamenco de Orilla a Orilla aims to raise awareness and exchange amongst the indigenous population and Moroccans resident in Andalusia so that they can identify with flamenco culture. It is of utmost importance to facilitate and promote a process of mutual understanding between Andalusia and Morocco, and I've emphasised this bit, that benefits the integration of Moroccans resident in Andalusia without renouncing their origins. Now, on one level, these sorts of institutional events, heavily subsidised by governmental funds, it should be said, do raise awareness of the Moroccan population in an attempt to stem back the tide, we might say, of anti-immigration and Islamophobia by illustrating commonality over otherness. Yet despite the involvement of Moroccan musicians in some of the concerts and workshops, the ability for these projects to benefit the integration of Moroccans resident in Andalusia, as this claims, is somewhat dubious. Few Moroccans were actually involved as audience or participants in the events themselves. Even though Suhail participated as a musician in his project and others like it, he's somewhat critical of the ways in which large institutions use music to promote interculturalism, because they end up attracting predominantly Spanish and tourist audiences. He feels that such projects have limited relevance for the wider Moroccan community and that they constitute a form of political interculturalism. But simply, they're more a case of showcasing the overlap between Moroccan and Andalusian culture to Andalusians, rather than necessarily an example of lasting dialogue between communities. Suhail also noted that such events might obscure the negative realities of Moroccan immigration, such as rising levels of racism, human trafficking, for example, across the Mediterranean, and the number of deaths that we've seen across the Strait of Gibraltar. Rather than confronting such problems, the tendency for large-scale institutional events is to conflate a somewhat utopian image of the past, of Al-Andalus, with a utopian image of multicultural diversity in the present. And to this end, Suhail has tried to engage in more socially oriented projects, often of his own making, that raise awareness of the more negative realities, such as the refugee crisis or human trafficking. One might ask then, why is Suhail involved in such institutional projects at all? Well, one level, this is simple pragmatism. By engaging in such events, Suhail benefits from the limited resources available to him as a Moroccan musician in Spain by tapping into institutional agendas. At the end of the day, musicians need gigs, even if they might be critical of the underlying basis for those gigs. But it's also important to bear in mind that Suhail believes more in the process, shall we say, of musical interculturalism than necessarily its political ramifications. Ultimately, Suhail sees interculturalism as more than simply a political project, something that's capitalised on by regional institutions to promote the ideals of an open and inclusive Andalusia. Rather, it is at the level of human interaction and exchange between people that Suhail finds the true potential for interculturalism. He sees music as a way to convivir, which is a Spanish word for literally to live together or coexist with, to convivir with Andalusians. And indeed, his music making has enabled him to establish long-lasting relationships and to conciliate his multiple identities. As a Moroccan, as a Spaniard, as an Andalusian, as a Granadino, someone who lives and comes from Granada, ultimately as a human being. It is music's capacity for connecting human experience that Suhail most believes in. And this is why he has sought to expand beyond these flamenco-Andalusi fusions. While he still views them as the sort of epitome of his musical interculturalism, he's aware that his difference as a Moroccan does become highly visible, and that these fusions may, for some people, actually end up reinforcing cultural stereotypes of the Oriental Moroccan rather than overcoming them. For example, at times he needs to sort of perform with typical Orientalist stereotypes such as belly dancers or what have you in certain contexts which has nothing to do with the sort of music that he's doing. As such, Suhail performs a range of other genres that are deemed more cosmopolitan, most notably blues, jazz and rock, and thus more closely aligned with cultural trends and tastes in Andalusia at large. He has a canny ability to move between styles and to suit different audiences. He describes himself, and I quote, as a musical chef who can cook up whatever you want and whatever I feel like. This capacity to move between various genres means he can interact with musicians from different backgrounds. And for Suhail, this ability to transcend cultural borders through his various musical competencies is not only a case of commercial pragmatism, but central to how he views interculturalism. Music provides the space for human interaction, a space in which differences and commonalities can be shared, negotiated, and reconciled. For Suhail, then, interculturalism through music is what the dance scholar Iona Mitra has called a life condition, and one that defines how he relates to Andalusian society at large. So just to summarise, I've given an account here of the ways in which one musician negotiates his social and musical world as a Moroccan other in the south of Spain. I argue that Suhar's music making might be viewed as what the ethnomusicologist Michael O'Toole has called sonic citizenship, where minority communities use music to shape public opinion, presenting one's community in a more positive light and challenging cultural stereotypes and prejudices that might be held by the host society. Suhar's music aligns with local narratives around Andalusian history and identity, enabling him to benefit from institutional support and to sensibilizar, raise awareness of the Moroccan community in Andalusia. However, I don't want to paint a utopian image here of happy hybridity and positivist multicultural living. Suhar's resources are limited, and he needs to adapt to commercial markets and local tastes in order to make his music palatable for the host society. Coupled with that, he's confronted by both a rise in Islamophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric, as well as a general trend in southern Spain towards the orientalisation of Moroccans for the tourism industry. But ultimately, music still forms an avenue through which Suhar has been able to build and maintain relations within Andalusia, to convivir with Andalusians. And I hope that this case study offers an insight into the complexities surrounding music and migration, how music can facilitate social integration while at the same time reinforce cultural stereotypes. So thank you very much. Yeah, I think we've got time for one or two questions before we move over to Vanessa.
Yeah, I've got a question which concerns kind of the UNESCO initiatives in Granada, which is, I think there's a kind of threefold UNESCO recognition of the Elbáz, then the recognition of Granada as a city of literature, and then the recognition of flamenco. But I think flamenco is seen as something anchored in the Andalusian Spanish nationality.
Yeah. So what was the question? Did you want just sort of more information on that wider context of UNESCO?
Yeah, so that some people who appropriate this kind of heritage for the political discourse or for navigating themselves.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that can be answered in a number of ways. I think in the context of flamenco specifically, it was, as you point out, it was declared as intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO in 2010. And that was a Spanish declaration. These declarations can only be carried forward by nation states. They can't be carried forward by regional bodies. But it's had most significance in the Andalusian context. And there's been renewed institutional support as a result of this declaration. More festivals, more money has gone in, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the I suppose you might say, consequences of this is this idea of flamenco being a completely international, a global form that can cross different boundaries, but also one that is rooted in multicultural living and rooted in the multicultural past of Andalusia. And that is very often foregrounded in the ways in which flamenco is sold internationally in contexts around the globe. And UNESCO really has sought to emphasise that process. Another interesting thing to bear in mind in the UNESCO context is that there was another failed candidature for flamenco back in 2004. And interestingly, it was for a dual declaration for intangible cultural heritage of flamenco and Arab Andalusian music. So the idea was to try to get some sort of dual recognition for these two traditions and their shared commonalities. Now that declaration failed. I mean, partly it was a terrible application. It was put together as, here's flamenco, here's Arab Andalusian music. We're not going to talk much about the way they're put together, other than say there was this group once that put these two genres together and it's all very happy-clappy. It was a terrible, terrible application, so it's no surprise that it didn't go forward. So eventually it was flamenco in and of itself that was declared as intangible cultural heritage. But going further here, the Andalusian government and, well, actually the Fundación Tres Culturas is now trying to lead the initiative to have Arab Andalusian music declared as intangible cultural heritage in cooperation with Maghrebi nation states and national governments, so Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, which is very interesting because you see a Spanish institution here trying to claim the heritageization of a genre that is predominantly of North Africa and has more sort of national sense in the North African context.
Thank you, it was fascinating. I wonder if I might ask you to scale out, in the first instance, the politics of minority versus majority with the process of cultural exchange, and then invite you to put those back together. If we explore some of the things you were talking about from the practices of somebody who is perhaps a majority, representing a majority sort of figure, then we'd be talking about cultural appropriation, rather than you used the expression that the musician lost something of himself in playing flamenco. I did think about that because you present him as being also, or he describes himself as being a chef who commands his audience. Very much therefore being able to exercise quite a degree of autonomy in aligning himself to whichever narrative is appropriate. And I just wondered how, translation isn't only about losing things, things are lost in crossing borders, but it is also about gaining. And I sort of wondered how you're going to reconcile these things. And I suppose really what I'm driving at is, or my sort of question is it quite easy to bring an overlay of politics, from the anthropologist to the current situation? Which actually complicates the analysis of actually cultural fusion. And I just wondered, I was just a bit uneasy how those things were coming together, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I mean, this is obviously a complex set of issues. Now, the premise for this particular paper that I'm going to develop into an article, and I've left out all the sort of theoretical background to this because I wasn't really aware of the audience and wanted it to be more about the actual ethnographic material. But the premise for this is that there's been some degree of work on this particular type of fusion, on Moroccan musical exchange in Granada particularly, and there's even been some mention of this particular performer in the work by Brian Carl that I did cite. And Brian Carl describes Suhail as a savvy showman, always sort of with an eye towards market possibilities. But a lot of the critique is often sort of grounded in the language of power inequality. And minority relations, and this idea, as you say, of sort of having to give something of oneself, or give up something of oneself. That seems to be the dominant position in some of the literature related to this area. Now, what I'm trying to do, in some roundabout way, is to offer a more sort of nuanced approach to this, to look at the ways in which a musician himself might position his own music making in relation to different discourses going on in society. Not simply to say that this is Suhail losing something of himself in order to integrate into society, but actually this is all the ways in which he uses music to, as I say, convivere, to live with Andalusians in different contexts. And here I've been quite influenced by recent work in multiculturalism studies that looks at the notion of everyday multiculturalism, rather than the sort of should we say, the heady sort of political ideology of multiculturalism as a policy practice. Rather, it's focusing on the everyday realities of multicultural living of different communities as they interact, the different sort of senses of the negotiation, of positive and negative, rubbing up against each other, communities rubbing up against each other in positive and negative ways. And it's this kind of idea of lived multiculturalism, everyday multiculturalism, that is really underpinning the direction in which I'm trying to go here, and looking at how, as I say, in this case, one musician negotiates his sort of social musical world, rather than this more top-down approach that focuses on power inequality and strategic essentialism and all that sort of direction. I hope that kind of answers your question.
We could have a discussion
at
a different stage about the complexities of multiculturalism and living in parallel with intercultural or translation that produces something different.
I'd love to talk to you afterwards, because it's something I'm relatively new to as an ethnomusicologist. It's not my main, it's not my comfortable disciplinary home, you might say. But I've read quite a lot now in the area of multiculturalism and interculturalism more generally, and it's just not come through in this particular paper. So it'd be great to talk afterwards. So I think, Tibu, would it be right to hold it till after at the end. I'm just thinking because we're at 20 past 5. Is that okay? Brilliant. So, Vanessa, over to you.
Good afternoon. Morocco's Jewish community has been multilingual, transnational, and highly mobile since its beginning. According to oral tradition, the first Jews came to Morocco in the years following the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE. Other Jewish migrations followed with the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Arabs, and finally in the years leading up to and after the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. Using Hebrew and Aramaic for liturgical and religious purposes, plus Arabic, Amazigh, which is Berber, and later Spanish and French to communicate with their neighbors and in the marketplace, being Jewish in the Maghreb meant mastering a level of comfort with cultural and linguistic code switching. Music is one of the areas of life where this code switching exists comfortably in bodies of disparate repertoires that are sung and learned side by side. The repertoires that they sing and sang mirrored this cultural layeredness. Once these individuals or communities emigrated from Morocco, they took their languages and their musics with them, additioning others to their palette. This paper will briefly explore the community-based repertoires of Moroccan Jews from the region of the Strait of Gibraltar from the 18th century until today. Between 2007 and 2017, I mapped out the repertoire of the remaining Jewish community of northern Morocco in Morocco, which stands today at less than 150 people, from a total remaining Jewish population of 1,500 in the country. 60 years ago, it was over 300,000. When I enumerated the complete musical repertoire that I gathered from my informants during a span of 10 years, it became clear that their repertoires were varied, multilingual, and highly porous. They embody a phenomenon which is diametrically opposed to the nationalistic trope of monolithic identities which lack suppleness and movement. Jewish Sephardi presupposes Judeo-Spanish, but no Arabic. Jewish presupposes Hebrew, above all, as a language for Jewish identity. Popular Amazigh music seems far from the world of these Jews, but found its way into the songbook of a man from Tangier from 2007. Any cliché of these Jews singing only romances in Judeo-Spanish, hailing from pre-expulsion Spain because of some sort of nostalgia for a lost Spanish homeland, has not arrived to the shores of Moroccan experiences. They sing some romances, but also wedding songs in Judeo-Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew liturgy, French chanson, satirical new local compositions, Israeli songs, flamenco, the repertoire of Sarita Montiel, Edith Piaf, and others. Their musical repertoire reflects the full spectrum of their simultaneous cultural and linguistic affiliations, which is transnational and highly mobile. According to the moment, space of performance, and context, they use these varied repertoires to negotiate their belonging to a virtually impermeable internal Hermetic community, 2, the larger Moroccan Jewish community, 3, the general Jewish world, 4, the Moroccan national identity, 5, an affiliation with Spanish culture, and 6, the general deterritorialized world. And these are actually, I would say it's not in ascending or descending order. They jump boundaries back and forth according to necessity. What I found to characterize this community's music is that they have repertoires that they consider theirs, which I have labeled internal, and others which form part of their lives, but that they draw a boundary around, considering them to be from other groups that they connect and belong to, which I have labeled external. Of course, there are times when the line is blurred, and after various generations, if a song is kept in the oral tradition, what had once been external then becomes internal. One of the most dramatic examples of this is the romance Una tarde de verano, which is, it actually originally comes from a 13th century Austrian lied called Kundrumslied. And it came into Spanish oral tradition, and from there it went into Moroccan Sephardi oral tradition. In the 20th century, it was sung as a song to warn Jewish girls in Casablanca, they changed the title, about being kidnapped from the Muslim majority. So through the oscillation from external repertoires into internal moments of intimacy and internal repertoires to public and semi-public moments of life cycle rituals, contemporary Sephardi Moroccan Jews seamlessly navigate through their multiplicity of communities and affiliations while protecting their very own cultural specificity. They layer on every new language and identity, integrating its repertoire in some manner while remaining attached to the internal songs that for them denote their historical, linguistic, and geographical particularities. Having analyzed the contemporary state of repertoire and its confirmed cosmopolitanism, I was interested in projecting this project backwards into the history of known repertoire collections. Was this cultural layering a mere product of modernity and the ruptures and migrations of the recent past? Or has this been the manner in which Sephardim have and continue to negotiate their identity transmission in an inclusive manner which absorbs elements of the surrounding cultures while protecting the boundaries of their group? This paper shows the very beginnings of my exploration into this question. Since we cannot recreate the evanescent moments of past musical performances that had not been captured by audio or video, one of the available tools that remains when wanting to project backwards in time are traces of orality that have been put down in writing. What other elements exist to help facilitate the reconstruction of the historical musical world of Maghrebi Jews in Morocco, Gibraltar, Malaga, or Barcelona? Other elements that can help reconstruct these intangible moments and inform its description, a photograph, a textual description by a traveler, and ultimately, these songbooks compiled by the performers themselves. Tracing the movement of musical repertoires of oral tradition has a constraint of the fragility of orality, making it impermanent and difficult to trace with exactitude. It could thus be assumed that scholarship could only track orality through fieldwork and ethnographic study within contemporary living traditions. However, some historical collections of songbooks afford us a window into lived oralities from various centuries ago that continue existing today, and that have been affected by the migrational histories of their interlocutors. These are basically notebooks with a list of repertoire written down by an individual in an effort to remember the words of either unfamiliar or new repertoire, or to fix known and traditional repertoire for transmission to the next generation. One important element to keep in mind is that these documents of orality only show a confirmed slice of their musical repertoire. It is the slice that they chose to write down. It is impossible to determine if there were other important repertoires that were not notated and which were truly exclusively oral and remain so lost to us to today. Notwithstanding, the songbooks that I have examined showed similar patterns of stylistic and linguistic multiplicity to the variety found in the oral traditions of the same community today. The porousness of repertoire found within these private books, which function as objects of orality, demonstrate the continued absorption and interpenetration of language and cultural references during various centuries, demonstrating that the current musical languages follow a similar historical pattern of absorption and multiplicity of languages and musical styles. Songbooks served as cultural reminders of the layered identities that Jews sought to preserve. Today, they serve as documents of transmission and culturally important elements of this community in diaspora. While keeping traditional repertoire, the writers of these songbooks absorbed important elements from their surroundings, demonstrating a multiplicity of cultural codes that coexist dynamically. This continual construction of their seemingly opposing roles as preservers and innovators of repertoire breaks all attempts at strict Maghrebi regionalism, while ensuring that certain traditional specificities remain untouched
and unchanged. Another element that is crucial to take into account is the different use of repertoire by the genders, which brings me to the reason I have chosen to present songbooks written by both men and women. Because of their access to schooling and the literacy needed to fulfill the liturgical obligations, as well as their professional necessity to speak and write in the vernacular language, Jewish men started writing songbooks almost 150 years before women did. It is interesting to note, to compare the difference, and sometimes not, of repertoire choices between the genders. Furthermore, in Jewish Maghrebi repertoire, songbooks are almost always exclusively textual, and there's no music notation, basically. And they invariably demonstrate the complexity of these Jews' cultural and linguistic palettes. It is these written traces of orality that I explore, which give us clues to the desire of these people's impulse to fix the details of a personal repertoire that might be forgotten if they had not notated it. Although our authors are all originally Moroccan, each one of these songbooks was written and preserved at a different point of the Mediterranean basin. This very fact, and the long historic span, serves as an indication of the typical mobility of Moroccan Jews, all while integrating new cultural elements while preserving others indicative of their cultural specificity. The earliest known songbook written by a Western Sephardi is the one of Abraham Israel, a Tetuani Jew living in Gibraltar, which is currently found at the National Library of Spain. I think it's important to notice that the title here, Los Sefardíes y la Poesía Tradicional Hispánica, Spanish traditional poetry. So they've very much made the point that this is a Spanish repertoire in the editing of this book. Between 1761 and 1770, when he was a teenager, he annotated a large repertoire into this songbook while living in Gibraltar and London. Paloma Diaz-Mas and Maria Sanchez Perez wrote a valuable annotated volume with details on his life and the repertoire that he included. Their listing of the repertoire in this songbook is as follows. First, a list of 36 titles from the Spanish comedias from 17th century by Lope de Vega, Tirso de Molina, and Calderón de la Barca, among others, which are very important writers of the Spanish Golden Age. 4 songs in English, the first of which is a Masonic text. An unintelligible song in lingua franca, which has words that resemble Italian. 3 religious Sephardi texts in Judeo-Spanish, 2 romances and a paraliturgical copla, a traditional romance, Las Hermanas Reina y Cautiva, still present in Moroccan oral tradition, Spanish songs, and you see all the different versions of those, an acrostic or a word puzzle on the word mujer, woman, denoting the horrible dangers of women. One of the elements that they bring out is the fact that there does not seem to be a hierarchy between high and low art in his writing. He has mixed obscene songs with material considered for the cultivated classes. Only this Sephardi material is separate, as if it were possibly added later after some blank pages that were never filled, and there's a difference in the direction of the writing as well as the penmanship. The Libro de Cantares de Baruch ben Tata is a private family manuscript written in the late 19th century, 1898, by a Tetuani Moroccan Jew in Gibraltar and Cairo. Baruch ben Tata was the son of Issachar ben Tata and Dona Wahnun. He was born in Tetuan in 1881, and he was a descendant of a 17th century Kabbalist called Rabbi Jacob Marachi, and of the revered chief rabbi Rabbi Yitzchak ben Walid. Baruch ben Tata was the youngest of 4 children, and in the early 1890s, his brother Abraham ben Tata migrated from Tetuan to South America, as did many other Jewish men at the time, prior to settling in Egypt. In the 1890s, Baruch ben Tata, his remaining siblings, and their parents migrated to Egypt. In about 1905, he married his cousin, very common practice in the community. They had 3 children, and continuing the family tradition, he was a textile merchant in Egypt together with his father, brothers, and uncles. He was very involved in Jewish communal life in Egypt, and he died in Cairo in 1954. I received a digital copy of this songbook from his great-grandson, who lives in Barcelona, and has the original in the family's private archive. So with a total of 43 song entries, I'm just giving you here a set of, you can read through these or not as you wish. The repertoire spans contemporary Spanish, Moroccan Judeo-Spanish, French, Egyptian, Turkish Judeo-Spanish, and Italian repertoires. Most of the texts are love songs or satirical songs about love, but some interesting entries describe the consequences of migration while traveling on a boat, and even the desire to go to New York for a brighter future. There is one paraliturgical song, Cantar de Moserrabeño from Morocco, and one from Turkey, Noche de Domingo. I will actually sing you a little portion of that one. El dio alto con su gracia, nos donde mucha ganancia, no veamos maliancia, no sea todo Israel. Bendito el abastado, que nos dio de honrado, cada Shabbat mejorado, nos dio todo Israel. And he continues with 3 songs for the 10 days of Teshuvah, Verdad y Falso, Lo Falso y la Verdad, which are sung during the 10 days of repentance between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. An interesting romance is the one which was written to commemorate the recent death of the Queen of Spain, La Reina Muerta, who died 6 months after her marriage at age 18 in 1878. Benedict had 2 interesting idiosyncrasies. When writing the word flower in whichever language, I'm not sure if you can see this, you can turn, actually if we can turn those lights off in the back, you can see this better because it's whites out a little bit. No, the other way, yeah. Yeah, there we go. Can I see? Yes. Yes. When writing the word flower in whichever language, he would write it invariably in red ink. And whenever the word star would appear, he would draw stars. When the word rose or blood appeared, he would also write it in red. I wonder if it's because he had a code for himself, or it was simply an aesthetic choice of a young adolescent boy with too much time on his hands. So something to think about. Since this is just a first initial look at the manuscript and its context, finding all the exact origins and context for the repertoire still remains to be done. These are 2. In October of 1913, the schoolgirl, and here you actually have a copy of the songbook on the bottom. Yeah, the bottom of that, you can pass it around if you'd like. The schoolgirl Reina de Naish from Alcázar noted a songbook predominantly of Spanish and French popular and patriotic songs. This notebook is a testament to her French Alliance Israélite Universelle education. As early as 1913, a girl of 15 was already able to write in Spanish and French in the small village close to the Atlantic coast, where in the 16th century the battle of the 3 Kings was fought and lost by the Portuguese king, which became a very important in the mind of the Jews because it kept the Inquisition at bay from Morocco. This village housed a small Jewish community, but one which was very attached to its musical tradition. This document, which her daughter told me in 2010, that I would find completely uninteresting because they only had Spanish songs and nothing de lo nuestro of our repertoire, is a snapshot of the repertoire that the Spanish Protectorate and the French Alliance Israélite Universelle schools had brought to their ears. It has a total of 39 songs, 36 in Spanish and 3 in French. This songbook does not have a single Judeo-Spanish traditional song. And this one right here that I've shown you is interesting because it's a version of Hatikva, which is the Zionist song, but what's now the Israeli national anthem, in Spanish in 1913, already in Morocco. Sonia Nijar, you can pass the next book around if you want also. Born in Casablanca from parents from Larachi, on the northern Atlantic coast of Morocco, emigrated to Israel in the early 1960s when she was a teenager. Through social media, she has become one of the current pillars of this community's remaining memory. She has a very active Facebook presence, which she fills in with family photos, information about Jewish life in Morocco, recipes, photos of traditional food. She has prepared photos of herself dressed in traditional costume, jokes in Judeo-Spanish, and her views on Israeli politics. In 2017, she self-published a book, which compiled many of the writings she had put on Facebook, adding a glossary in Haketia, in Moroccan Judeo-Spanish, and finally, 96 songs. This compilation includes songs for the bride and the wedding celebrations, humorous songs, children's songs, and lullabies from page 213 to 255, towards the end of the book. She describes the songs as the most vital element of what later began to be known as Sephardi culture, from what the Jews took with them at the moment of the expulsion from Spain in 1492. She continues, here are the songs interpreted by those that were exiled, that were our great-grandmothers, grandmothers, and mothers. In these songs, we see that it was the women who were singing to the bride, the groom, the mother-in-law, the daughter-in-law, while they embroidered the trousseau the day they washed wool, when they filled in mattresses and pillows for the bride and groom, when they took the bride to the ritual bath, or the boy or girl that was just born, for circumcisions, bar mitzvahs, days of the wedding, and even when a family member died. In conclusion, this small sampling of songbooks, written by Jews in Morocco and its diaspora, and with repertoire hailing from throughout the Mediterranean basin, demonstrate one aspect of the construction of sonic belonging. The first element we notice is the most obvious. Which songs get notated and which ones don't. The information in the blank spaces. What are the musical desires of these specific notators? Are they evoking the similar oscillatory pattern between inner and outer repertoire that contemporary Jews in Morocco engage in? And not surprisingly, invariably, it is the case that when the writer is in diaspora or feels that the transmission of the communal traditions may be in jeopardy, then it is that their repertoire appears highlighted in their choice of material to notate. The issues of shifting cultural soundscapes and transnational music are a key element behind the musical desires of Jewish singers, musicians, and audiences during the last 250 years, as a long historical arc of these songbooks shows. Music plays a central role for this minority group that guards its cultural and religious specificity while integrating to the majority culture. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Vanessa. Do we have any questions for Vanessa before we open this up?
I have a question, and I'm just interested to see that in the songbooks there's no notation, and I just wondered whether people had different tunes to sing to, or how those, whether there was just an understanding that these words went with particular tunes.
So it's interesting. I mean, this is one of the things that's frustrating. For example, when you don't know the tune and you don't have access to it, but many of them are, it's an oral tradition, right? So it's just, it's to be able to access the text. So you should know the tune. If you are to receive this book, then the tune has been transmitted to you. Many of for example, some of the songbooks are mothers that will write it for their descendants. So those, of course, they've been singing these songs in the family, and so, but it's difficult to remember these long texts. Sometimes actually they would there's something interesting that's happened after ethnomusicologists came and did a lot of field work, is that they would get some of these printed anthologies, and then they would hand write them out into the songbook. So you have this song that was 40 pages, and you're thinking, how could they remember this? Well, honestly, they didn't. They had copied it down. They used it to be able to sing from. And I would say probably some of the other songs that were notated earlier, like some of the songbooks from the 18th and 19th centuries, were songbooks that people would use when they wanted to fix something, remember it, and access it while knowing the tune. Sometimes, actually, it's interesting, there's another element that I didn't talk about, is that there are many liturgical songbooks that have liturgical prayers that use popular songs as the tunes. And they'll have written out in Judeo-Arabic or in Judeo-Spanish, sing this liturgical poem to this tune. So you're supposed to know, of course, the tune to that other popular musical material. But yeah, in all the songbooks, I have only one that has music. Yes?
Yes, thank you very much. I was interested in the aspect of text in these songs because you mentioned some of the Golden Age Spanish writers, Iberian writers, but there's also the Sephardi writers who are often, or sometimes by some people, considered of the Golden Age of Hebrew, kind of Iberian literature. And then, of course, there's also the Arab Andalusian poets of the 11th century before that. And I wondered if these texts are still important in these songs, or if the singers are aware of what they're singing, of what the weight and the heritage is, or if that doesn't matter. And also, what is the importance of this for young people, and how is this evolving and changing?
So I'll start with the last. One of the problems about what's happening now is language. So a lot of the people that are in Moroccan diaspora and in northern Moroccan diaspora do not speak Judeo-Spanish anymore because they either moved to France or to Israel. So they'll have certain words that they know, or maybe short songs, and they know the tunes, and they'll just sing them at very, very highly ritualized moments of the life cycle, like the night before the wedding, period. Like that's it. It's all kind of reduced down to that one night. But however, for example, like the Hebrew poetry, Hebrew mystical poetry of like Shlomo Ibn Birol and Yehuda Levi and all that material is still sung daily in the synagogue. And people do know, well, not everybody, but the people that lead the services do know who the writers were, and they'll know what the text is meaning, and they'll actually talk about that and doing something which I like to describe as a collapsing of time. So where they feel like that moment of Andalusian, Al-Andalus exists today. For the Arabic music is mostly through Andalusian repertoire, and in the Judeo-Arabic Moroccan community, they actually take the tunes of the Andalusian repertoire into the synagogue, and so many of them know, and they have something called matruz, which is singing one line in Arabic and one line in Hebrew, and then there are some women actually that take the same tunes because they're so popular, and they make short satirical songs for their family members with that Andalusian music. So it's all kind of very crisscrossed and very integrated into the totality of their lives. I think I answered all the different questions. Yeah, was there something else that I missed?
Outside the synagogue, kind of in a political context, also concerning national identities and, as we heard, also migrants and kind of border aspects, how is this music important for that?
That's a whole other paper, because it is very used and very politicized. The Andalusian music and the use of Jewish singers for like national Moroccan politics in the international sphere, like parading out the Jewish singers to international audience singing Arabic Andalusian music.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that happening.
Okay.
But that's for another day.
Okay.
So thank you very much. I think it will open up probably for, great.
So,
Or should I take this out of here and do something? Simpler than that.
I'm going to try and leave this in the background. You've got all our contact details there, website, social media, so on and so forth. So I hope you've enjoyed the session. It's been in some way interesting. There's obviously a diverse range of case studies here, but there's a number of themes that seem to connect the different case studies that we're dealing with around the ways in which music can be used to maintain cultural identities in the diaspora. Often you get a sense in which communities migrant communities in diasporic contexts around the globe tend to often feel more of an impulse to maintain cultural identities. And often music is one way in which that's achieved through various local networks, social media and so on. But also we've sort of touched on some of the cultural contacts and hybridities that emerge as music and musics, repertoires and communities move into new places of belonging. And I think Vanessa's paper really sort of touches on that, in particular sort of multiplicity of Jewish repertoires and this idea of sort of inside, outside repertoires and some that are coming into contact in various meaningful ways. And then finally, another theme that seems to have connected the papers is this idea of social integration and contact, how music might be used to facilitate a degree of intercultural dialogue and integration, or at times can actually become a sort of reinforcer, you might say, of cultural difference and otherness. So that's a very brief kind of pick of some of the main points that I felt were running through the papers. So I'd like to just open it up to a very general discussion. We've got 10 minutes thereabouts. If anybody has any general comments or specific questions to, I know Tuba, you had a question earlier, so if anybody has specific questions to any of the panellists, then yes, I'll just open it up to the floor.
This may be a very naive question, but I guess I'm wondering about the role of schools, the role of education in promulgating some of these musical traditions, and whether or not the musical traditions change as the composition of a particular community changes. And I'm also wondering about, let's say, village events. I come from a rural village, and there were various events during the year which included musical traditions. And as people moved into the village, how much really, as they moved in, then we took on their traditions too. So the traditions in the village changed. We introduced new events, so I just wondered whether that was relevant.
I'd like to say something about the schools, actually, because in Morocco during I don't know if you are all familiar with this, but in 1865 there was actually a French Jewish schools that started in Morocco and then spread out through the Mediterranean basin for the Sephardim, and they brought in French culture and French songs and French language and literature and all that, which actually meant that when the Protectorate started in 1912, the Jews were kind of ready, quote unquote, or primed to connect to the French. There were also Spanish schools. So there was kind of a race between the French and the Spanish. And the Spanish had their schools as well. And there were Sephardi school teachers in the Spanish schools at times. But they were not allowed to speak in Haketia, in Moroccan Judeo-Spanish. They were actually hit in class if they spoke in Haketia. They had to speak in Spanish. So, which means, I imagine, that they would not sing their songs, but they would sing the Spanish songs, which you see in that songbook, you know, the Serranillo and the this and the that and the other, you know, these Sarita Montiel. And so definitely the schools at that point had something that were important. Today it's interesting because the schools in Casablanca, the Jewish schools, for example, they do 2 shows a year, one for Hanukkah and one for Purim. And there are actually never traditional Moroccan Jewish songs in there, except for once that I insisted and brought in a Judeo-Spanish song. But usually they're Hebrew, Israeli, English songs, French Jewish songs. So there's all this other, a lot of English, actually. They think it's hip. So it's really interesting to see how these repertoires change, and their own material is considered to be like they just know it. You know, it's just around, so we don't have to teach it.
Yeah, this is a really good question actually, and I don't think it's a naive question at all. It's not something I've dealt a lot with in my research, I must admit, but specifically related to schools. But from sort of wider knowledge of the way flamenco particularly works in the Andalusian context, there has been a lot of emphasis from the regional government in particular, and there's a specific institution called the Andalusian Institute of Flamenco, which is it's an arm of the cultural department that's invested specifically with developing and disseminating flamenco within the region and further abroad. And one of their aims has been to try to develop flamenco in the school setting via not simply the sort of idea of, kids are going to learn to dance the Sevillanos or whatever and wear flamenco dresses and so on. Rather, the way in which they've tried to do it is to use flamenco as a vehicle to teach other aspects of Andalusian history and cultural identity and so on. So, for example, they use the distribution of flamenco song styles to teach aspects of Andalusian geography, the idea of certain aspects of flamenco style and performance to teach, as I was talking about earlier, the notion of multicultural diversity in Andalusia's past. So it's kind of become an avenue, you might say, through which a sense of regionalism, Andalusian regionalism, is imparted in the school context. Now, there's been actually quite a lot of opposition to this, interestingly, amongst educational sectors, and some teachers will feel that flamenco doesn't really belong in the school in this kind of way, that it's a folk tradition, it has more to do with gypsy communities and so on, and there are unfortunate sort of associations with the flamenco to do with alcoholism and criminality and so on. So there is a degree of tension around here. But also I think in the context of Suhail's work, I briefly touched on that he has actually engaged with schools, not directly in schools, but rather there's been there's been school visits to the public library in which he works, and he actively uses music there to teach aspects of regional history. He does that through key figures in Andalusian and Moroccan history, key musicians, musical styles and so on and so forth. So there is that sense in which music is used in an educational setting as a way of trying to facilitate a degree of sort of, should we say, cultural awareness in the region. Did you want to add, Steve?
Well, it's just it's interesting to note in Algeria, so a lot of the music schools and the music conservatoires that exist today are the legacy of French colonialism. So during the French colonial period, 1830 to 1962, Algeria was seen as kind of an integral part of France, and so the same sorts of music schools and musical networks for teaching were built up within Algeria. So when in 1962 there was this break from French, there was a complete rejection of kind of Western classical training in many ways, but the mechanisms and the institutions that had supported that sort of teaching remained and were transferred to Andalusian music. So while the repertoire and the music itself has completely changed as that kind of break in 1962, the infrastructure and the institutions that support that are a direct legacy of colonialism.
Caroline?
Yes, I was really interested in all of your talks and the distinctions that came out between people who were keen to preserve the music from their country of origin and those who were sort of working together and fusing sort of different music, so maybe from country of residence and country of origin. And I just wondered whether you had thought about why some people look to try and preserve and why others are engaged in that process of interculturalism or fusion, and what maybe sort of lies beneath that. Is it to do with a sense of security about their position in the country that they're living in, or citizenship? I don't know, or sense of identity. I was just really interested to know whether you sort of, how far you've gone along to that train of thought.
It's a difficult question. I think that depends on the individual, largely, at least in my setting. And I don't think it's an either-or scenario either. We have a number of musicians who would be, a bit of both, that they're very invested in trying to preserve, dare I say, quote-unquote, cultural authenticity, whatever that might look like, cultural traditions more associated with back home, so to speak. And equally, they engage in sort of intercultural projects. And so musicians are very commercially savvy, and they need to be in order to get gigs. So they very often, have many different aspects to their personas in order to benefit from whichever context they're working in.
I think in my case, actually, it's the more that they feel that their traditions are threatened, the more they actually seek to preserve. And when they're sitting in a position of the tranquility of their own self-identity, not feeling like it might get lost, then they're interested in absorbing all sorts of materials from the outside. So, but if not, then there's really like a total whittling down to the basic core, that level 1 that I put in that original list. And that becomes what is handed over. And then everything else kind of just falls to the side.
Yeah, I think it's got in the case of research I do, it's linked very much to repertoire in some cases and sort of music that people are performing. So an Andalusian musician who's trained in that kind of, in that world and gone through that sort of system of training, much like a Western classical musician, might in some cases want to keep that tradition in a kind of a set, conservative way, and keep the tradition alive in some ways, and might be more restricted to playing that repertoire in some cases. But that's obviously not the case for musicians. So I think it's this. I think you see the same sorts of parallels with musicians all around the world who depending on the repertoire they play, are more or less likely to engage with those sorts of fusion projects.
So it is 6 o'clock, so unless there's any other questions or comments.
Well, perhaps people can carry on the conversations. We have refreshments afterwards, which you are please more than welcome to stay behind. But may I just say thank you very much to our 3 speakers for a really intellectually rich and stimulating set of presentations. Thank you very much indeed. We look forward to hearing more in the future as the project progresses. So, thank you very much.